Her family left the obese girl for dead after she got pregnant. Only the Amish man helped. Her young woman stumbles through the snow, clutching her belly, her kin's wagon wheels fading into the dark, alone, freezing. Forgotten, then a lantern's glow. The creak of wagon wheels. A plain-dressed man steps down, offering his hand where no one else would. But this act of mercy sparks fury. Whispers in town call her shameful. Accusations rise in the courtroom. And the man who abandoned her once before rides back, demanding the child as his own. Dust swirls in the street. A church bell tolls. The law waits to decide her fate. She has nothing but her courage, his faith, and a newborn in her arms. Will this outcast mother lose everything again? Will love and mercy prove stronger than shame? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter winter wind howled across the San Luis Valley, driving sheets of snow against the log walls of the farmhouse. Inside, lamplight flickered across the weathered faces of Zoe May's family gathered around the supper table. Steam rose from bowls of bean soup as spoons clinked against tin in uncomfortable silence. Zoe's hands trembled as she set down her spoon. "I got something to tell you all," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words she'd practiced for weeks caught in her throat as her father's stern gaze fixed upon her. "Well, girl." "Speak up," he demanded, his calloused fingers drumming against the tabletop. Drawing a shaky breath, Zoe pressed her hand to her middle. I'm carrying a child. The drifter who stayed on last summer." Her voice cracked as her sister's eyes widened. Her father's fist crashed down, rattling the dishes. "Useless?" he roared, face reddening beneath his gray beard. "Ain't you brought enough shame on this family?" Her oldest sister, Sarah, smirked behind her hand, while Mary Jane giggled outright. "Always knew she'd come to no good," Sarah whispered loud enough for all to hear. "Please," Zoe begged, tears spilling down her round cheeks. "I didn't mean to." Her father stood, his chair scraping across the plank floor. "Just like you didn't mean to eat us near out of house and home all these years. Just like you didn't mean to scare off every decent suitor with your size." The argument grew heated, bitter words flying like the snow outside. Within minutes, her father grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the door. "Get your things. You ain't staying under my roof another night." Zoe stumbled to her room, stuffing what clothes she could into a bundle while her mother watched silently from the doorway. Not one word of protest passed her lips. The wagon creaked through the deepening snow, her father driving while her brother held the lantern. Zoe huddled in the back, shivering despite her heavy shawl. They traveled beyond the edge of town, past the last homestead, until they reached a frozen arroyo cutting through the prairie. "Out," her father commanded, his breath frosting in the frigid air. "Papa, please," Zoe pleaded. "The baby ain't my concern." He cut her off. Her brother grabbed her arm, roughly helping her down from the wagon. Her bundle of clothes landed beside her in the snow. The wagon wheels groaned as they turned away, the lantern's glow growing fainter until darkness swallowed it completely. Zoe stood alone, snowflakes settling on her shoulders as tears froze on her cheeks. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, one hand pressed to her belly where new life grew. "Please don't let us die out here." Hours passed as Zoe struggled through the deepening snow. Her feet had long since gone numb, her fingers stiff inside her worn gloves. She followed the rutted trail as best she could, though the white darkness made everything look strange and foreign. Somewhere in the distance, wolves began to howl. The sound sent chills down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, each step becoming harder than the last. "Just keep moving," she told herself, though her words slurred from cold and fatigue. But her body had reached its limit. As midnight approached, Zoe's knees buckled beside the snow-covered trail. She clutched her precious bundle of clothes as she sank down. Too exhausted to go another step, the wolves' cries seemed closer now, carried on the bitter wind. Zoe curled around her middle, trying to protect the innocent life within her from the killing cold. Her eyes grew heavy as snowflakes gathered on her lashes. "Please," she prayed once more, her voice fading to a thread. "If not for me, then for my baby." The words trailed off as consciousness slipped away, leaving her collapsed in the snow as the winter storm raged on and hungry wolves called in the darkness. The eastern sky had barely begun. Too pale when Brian Lapp guided his team of horses. Along the snow-covered wagon track, his breath frosted in the crisp morning air as he squinted through the dim light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hushed landscape draped in white. Something dark caught his eye against the pristine snow. At first, he thought it might be a fallen branch, but as his wagon drew closer, his heart seized. A human form lay crumpled beside the trail, partially covered by fresh powder. "Whoa there!" Brian called softly to his horses, pulling them to a stop. He climbed down from the wagon, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached the still figure. It was a woman, he realized, her face peaceful as if sleeping. But sleeping in this cold meant death. Brian knelt beside her, pressing gentle fingers against her neck. A pulse fluttered beneath his touch, weak but steady. Thank the Lord, she still lived. As he shifted her slightly, he noticed the swell of her belly beneath her thin shawl. His chest tightened with concern. She carried a child. "Miss..." He called softly, but she didn't stir. The cold had taken a firm hold. Without hesitation, Brian slipped his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. He lifted her carefully, noting how the snow had soaked through her dress. Her bundle of belongings lay nearby, which he gathered up as well, with measured steps. He carried her to his wagon and laid her gently on a thick quilt in the bed. Brian tucked the blanket around her still form, then climbed back to the driver's seat. He clicked his tongue at the horses, turning them toward home. The morning sun began to warm the air as they traveled. Though frost still glittered on every surface, his plain homestead came into view by mid-morning, a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, where he'd banked the fire before leaving. A small barn stood nearby, and beyond that stretched his fields, now dormant under their blanket of snow. A soft moan from the wagon bed caught his attention. Brian glanced back to see the woman stirring, her eyes fluttering open. Confusion clouded her face as she took in her surroundings. Then fear flickered across her features when she spotted him. "Be at peace," Brian said gently, his Pennsylvania Dutch accent softening the words. "You're safe now." She struggled to sit up, pulling the quilt tighter around herself. "Who? Where am I?" "I'm Brian Lapp," he answered, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Found you by the trail this morning, near Frozen. God led me to you, I reckon." Her eyes took in his plain black hat and neat beard, understanding dawning on her face. "You're Amish?" Brian nodded as he guided the wagon to a stop before his cabin. "That I am." "Can you tell me your name?" "Zoe," she whispered. "Zoe May." Her hand moved protectively to her middle. "Well, Zoe May, let's get you inside, where it's warm. Think you can manage a bit of broth?" Tears welled in her eyes at the simple kindness in his voice. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Brian helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, supporting her when her legs trembled. Inside the cabin, everything was neat and simple. A few sturdy chairs, a table worn smooth by years of use, and a hearth where coals still glowed beneath the ashes. He settled her in the chair closest to the fire, adding logs until flames danced merrily from a peg on the wall. He took down a thick woolen shawl, deep blue and clearly well-loved. "This was my Rebecca's," he said softly, draping it around Zoe's shoulders. She'd want you to have its warmth. Zoe's fingers traced the fine weave. Your wife. The Lord called her home to winters past. Brian moved to the hearth, where a pot of broth simmered. He ladled some into a cup and brought it to her. As warmth slowly returned to her limbs, Zoe's mind began to race. What would people say when they learned she was here? An unmarried woman carrying a child, staying in the home of a widowed man, even an Amish one. Gossip spread faster than wildfire in the valley. She could already imagine the whispers, the sidelong glances, the judgment in people's eyes. The judgment in people's eyes. But where else could she go? Her family had cast her out, and she had no money for travel. The baby would come before winter's end. She could feel it in the way the child moved within her. Brian had saved their lives, yet his kindness might cost him his good name in the community. Zoe sipped the warm broth, feeling torn between gratitude for her rescue and fear of what tomorrow might bring. The fire crackled softly in the hearth and outside the window. Snow began to fall once more. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Brian Lapp's homestead. After a simple breakfast, Brian led Zoe outside, his boots leaving deep prints in the fresh snow. The morning air bit at their faces as he showed her around his modest farm. Not much to look at in winter, Brian said, gesturing to the fields stretching white and empty before them. But come spring, we'll plant corn and wheat. The Lord provides enough to get by. They approached a weathered barn where two brown cows lifted their heads at their entrance, steam rising from their nostrils. This here's Betsy and Rose, Brian explained, patting one's flank. Good milkers, both of them. Beyond the barn, a fenced yard held a dozen chickens scratching in the straw he'd scattered. Eggs most days, he said, and the hens keep me company in their own way. Despite her obvious fatigue, Zoe insisted on helping with the morning chores. I can't just sit idle while you take care of me, she said, picking up a broom inside the cabin. Brian watched as she swept the plank floor with careful strokes. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, but determination sparked in her eyes. At the cook stove, she stirred a pot of porridge while he showed her how to bank the fire just right. Before they ate, Brian bowed his head in silent prayer. Zoe watched, touched by the simple reverence of the moment. When he finished, she asked, "Why do you pray without words?" "We believe in letting our hearts speak to God," he explained, breaking a piece of bread. Words aren't always needed. Later, as they washed the dishes together, Zoe noticed there were no weapons in the cabin, no rifle above the door like in her family's home. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked. "Of wolves or thieves?" Brian dried a bowl with careful hands. "We follow Christ's teaching of peace," he said softly. "No guns, no fighting. It's not always the easy path, but it's ours. When someone does wrong, we pray for them instead of seeking revenge." Zoe thought of her family's harsh words, their abandonment. The idea of praying for those who hurt you seemed foreign. Yet something in Brian's gentle manner made her wonder. By afternoon, Zoe was determined to help prepare supper. She stood at the table, knife in hand, trying to chop vegetables. But the room began to spin, black spots dancing before her eyes. The knife clattered to the table as her knees buckled. Brian caught her before she fell, his strong hands steady at her elbows. "Easy now," he murmured, helping her to a chair. "You're still weak from the cold. There's no shame in resting." "I'm sorry," Zoe whispered, one hand pressed to her belly. "I just want to do my part." "You need to heal," Brian said firmly. "The baby needs you strong." He finished chopping the vegetables himself while she rested by the fire. That evening, after the dishes were cleared, Brian lit a lamp and opened his worn Bible. The German words flowed like music as he read, his voice soft and reverent in the quiet cabin. Zoe listened, watching shadows dance on the walls while snow tapped gently against the shutters. Though she couldn't understand the words, peace settled over her like a blanket. The next day, Brian had to go into town for supplies. Zoe stayed behind, tending to the chickens and straightening the already neat cabin. When he returned, his face was troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked. Brian hesitated before answering. "People talk," he said finally. "It's best you know. They're saying unkind things about you being here." Zoe's cheeks burned with shame. By the end of the week, she had to fetch water from the town well herself. As she worked the pump handle, she heard the whispers. "That's her, the fallen girl staying with the Amishmen. Shameful. That's what it is. Never thought one of them plain folk would harbor such sin." The words cut deep. Reopening wounds barely beginning to heal. She hurried back to Brian's cabin with her full bucket, water sloshing over her skirts. Inside, she found him reading his Bible at the table, the morning light touching his gentle face. He looked up as she entered, concern in his eyes when he saw her expression. "Don't let their words trouble you," he said softly. "God sees your heart, not their judgment." Zoe set down the water bucket, her hands trembling. "But they're right about me. I am fallen. I've brought shame to your home too." Brian shook his head. "Judge not, lest the be judged." That's what the good book says. We're all God's children, in need of mercy. His simple words wrapped around her heart like a warm shawl. Outside, the winter wind howled, but inside Brian's cabin, Zoe found herself learning a different way, one of peace, forgiveness, and quiet faith. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snowy street as Brian's wagon rattled into town. Zoe huddled closer to him on the wooden seat, pulling her borrowed shawl tight against the biting wind. The horses' hooves clopped steadily on the packed dirt of Main Street, drawing attention from townsfolk going about their business. "Just need flour and lamp oil," Brian said quietly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Won't take but a minute." As they passed the milliner's shop, two women stopped their conversation to stare openly, their faces twisted with undisguised contempt. Zoe felt her cheeks grow hot despite the chill as she caught fragments of their whispered words. Shameless thing. Living under his roof, a sharp-faced woman in a dark dress stood in the doorway of the dress shop, her eyes narrowed. "His kept woman," she muttered, loud enough to carry. Zoe's hands trembled as she gripped the shawl tighter. She glanced at Brian, but his expression remained serene. He merely touched the brim of his black hat as they passed, acknowledging the onlookers with simple dignity. The wagon came to a stop outside Miller's Mercantile. Brian stepped down first, then helped Zoe descend carefully. The wooden steps creaked under their boots as they entered the store. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee beans and leather goods filled the air. Mr. Miller stood behind the counter, arranging jars of hard candy. When he saw them, his usually friendly face grew stern. He didn't move to help them right away, instead making a show of reorganizing items that needed no attention. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," Brian said evenly. "We'll need 10 pounds of flour and 2 bottles of lamp oil." The shopkeeper hesitated, his hands hovering over the candy jars. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he moved to gather their items. Zoe stood close to Brian, feeling the weight of judgment pressing down like a physical thing. The transaction was completed in tense silence. As they left the store, Zoe noticed how Mr. Miller wiped the counter where Brian had placed his money. The ride home seemed longer than the journey into town. Heavy clouds gathered overhead, promising more snow. Zoe could no longer hold back the tears that had been threatening all afternoon. "I'm ruining everything for you," she said, her voice breaking. "You're standing in the community, your good name, all because you showed kindness to someone like me." Brian guided the horses carefully around a frozen rut before answering. "The only standing that matters is how we stand before God," he said quietly. "And he sees past rumors to truth. But they're all judging you," Zoe persisted. "Because of me, let them judge," Brian replied. "Their words can't change what's right. Helping someone in need, that's what the good book teaches us." When they reached the cabin, Brian tended to the horses while Zoe started supper. She moved slowly around the kitchen, her mind still full of the townsfolk's condemning faces. The beans bubbled in the pot as she mixed cornbread batter, trying to focus on the simple tasks rather than her fears. Over their evening meal, lit by the warm glow of the lamp, Zoe finally voiced what terrified her most. "I'm scared," she admitted, pushing her beans around her plate. "About the baby coming? About doing it alone?" Brian set down his spoon, his face gentle in the lamplight. "You're not alone now," he said firmly. "Whatever comes, we'll face it with God's help." "You mean that?" Zoe asked, hardly daring to believe such unconditional support. "I do," Brian nodded. "The Lord brings people into our lives for a purpose. Sometimes that purpose ain't clear right away, but we trust in His wisdom." After they cleared the dishes, Brian took out his Bible. Before Zoe retired to her room, he read aloud in English instead of his usual German. "The Lord is my refuge and my fortress, my God. In Him will I trust." The words seemed to fill the cabin with peace, even as the wind picked up outside. Zoe paused at her door, watching Brian close the Bible with reverent hands. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Brian smiled slightly, the kindness in his eyes unchanged by the day's trials. "Rest well," he said. In her room, Zoe could hear the storm building, its gusts rattling the wooden shutters against the cabin walls. She pulled her quilt closer, thinking of Brian's words about trust and refuge. Despite the growing tempest outside, she felt safer than she had in months. The bitter January wind howled across the valley, piling snow against the cabin's walls. Inside, warmth from the wood stove filled the small space as Zoe settled into the rhythm of farm life. Each morning, she wrapped herself in her shawl and ventured out to gather eggs, her boots crunching through fresh snow to reach the chicken coop. The hens clucked softly as she reached beneath them, collecting warm eggs in her basket. Some mornings, when the sun broke through the clouds, its pale light would catch the frost on the fence posts, making them sparkle like diamonds. These quiet moments brought her peace she hadn't known before in the dairy shed. Zoe learned to work the butter churn, her arms growing stronger as she pressed the wooden paddle up and down. The steady motion was soothing, almost like a prayer. Brian showed her how to wash the butter in cold water, working out the buttermilk until it was clean and sweet. Evenings found her by lamplight, needle flashing as she mended Brian's worn shirts. Her stitches grew neater with practice, and she took pride in making each repair nearly invisible. The familiar task reminded her of happier times with her mother, before judgment had replaced love. One crisp morning, as Zoe scattered grain for the chickens, the birds' eager pecking and funny strutting made her laugh out loud. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed freely. Brian, stacking firewood nearby, paused at the sound. A gentle smile crossed his face as he watched her among the clucking hens. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Brian spoke of his late wife, Sarah. His voice grew soft with memory as he described her skill with herbs, her gift for calming spooked horses, her quiet strength during drought years. "She could sing like an angel," he said, stroking the worn Bible in his lap. The house felt empty of music after she passed. Zoe's heart ached for his loss. Yet she felt touched that he would share such precious memories with her. It spoke of trust she hadn't earned but desperately wanted to deserve. When Sunday arrived, Brian surprised her by asking if she'd join him at meeting. "It's held at the Yoder family's house," he explained. "All are welcome there." Zoe hesitated, knowing how others might view her presence. But Brian's steady gaze gave her courage. She donned her plainest dress and wrapped her shawl tight. Against the morning chill, The meeting house was a simple wooden structure, its unadorned walls matching the plain dress of the families gathering inside. As Zoe entered beside Brian, conversation stilled. Several women turned their backs deliberately, their caps bobbing as they whispered among themselves. An elder man with a long gray beard frowned deeply at her presence. "Outsiders bring trouble," he muttered to his neighbor, loud enough for Zoe to hear. "The English girl has no place here." Zoe's cheeks burned with shame as she took a seat near the back. Throughout the service, conducted partly in German, she felt the weight of suspicious glances. Her heart sank lower with each passing minute. She had hoped Brian's people might be more forgiving than her own family. But their rejection stung just as sharply. Brian remained steadfast beside her, his presence a shield against the worst of the judgment. When one man spoke sharply about maintaining pure community, Brian calmly quoted scripture about showing kindness to strangers. His quiet defense moved Zoe deeply. The ride home was silent, but not uncomfortable. As evening settled over the valley, Zoe finally found words for her gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly as they sat by the fire, "for defending me today, even when your own people doubted. I never meant to bring discord to your community." Brian looked up from feeding another log to the flames. "Forgiveness must be lived, not spoken," he replied gently. "Words are easy. Actions show what we truly believe." Something shifted in Zoe's heart at his words. Despite the morning's rejection, she felt a small flame of belonging here. In this simple cabin, with this quiet man who lived his faith so purely. His acceptance outweighed all other judgment, as the fire crackled and snow fell soft outside. Zoe realized she was starting to think of this place as home. Not just shelter from necessity, but truly home. The thought both comforted and frightened her. Like holding something precious and fragile in her hands, March winds swept across the valley, carrying the first hints of spring's thaw. In Brian's cabin, Zoe sat at the wooden table, her bowl of stew untouched. Something had changed today, fluttered deep within, like a butterfly's wing. Then a distinct kick that made her gasp. The baby was moving. Brian looked up from his meal, concern crossing his weathered face. "Are you unwell?" Zoe pressed her hand to her growing belly. "The baby," I felt it move. Really move. Her voice trembled. "It makes everything so real now." In the lamplight, her fears spilled out like water from a broken dam. What if I can't do this? What if something goes wrong? Her fingers twisted in her apron. I've heard stories of women who... She couldn't finish the sentence. Brian set down his spoon, his expression thoughtful. "There's a midwife in town, Mrs. Wilkins. She's helped bring many babies into this world, including some in our community." He spoke carefully, measuring each word. "She's known for her skill and discretion. Would you consider meeting her?" Zoe nodded, relief washing over her. The thought of facing childbirth alone had haunted her dreams. The next week, Brian hitched the horses to the wagon. The morning air was crisp, but held a softness that spoke of changing seasons. They rode into town, past melting snowdrifts that revealed patches of brown grass beneath Mrs. Wilkins. Lived in a neat white house at the edge of town. She opened her door to them, a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and clear, intelligent eyes. Her hands were strong and capable, her manner brisk but kind. "Come in, child," she said to Zoe. "Let's have a proper look at you." In the tidy parlor, Mrs. Wilkins examined Zoe with gentle efficiency. Her questions were direct, but never unkind. She noted Zoe's strong back, good color, and the healthy movement of the baby. "You're young and sturdy," she declared. "No reason this birth shouldn't go well. With proper care and God's blessing." She turned to Brian, who waited respectfully in the hallway. "I'll need to stay at your place when her time comes." "Might be a day or two." Brian nodded. "You'll be welcome, Mrs. Wilkins. We're grateful for your help." The ride home felt lighter, as if a weight had lifted from Zoe's shoulders. The wagon wheels splashed through puddles of melting snow, and the afternoon sun warm on their faces. In this moment of peace, Zoe found courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind. "Brian," she began softly, "why did you never marry again? After Sarah?" She held her breath, fearing she'd overstepped. Brian was quiet for a long moment, guiding the horses around a muddy patch in the road. "Grief can be a hard companion," he finally said. For a long time, it was enough to just wake up each day and do what needed doing. He adjusted the reins in his calloused hands. "But I prayed for purpose beyond my own sorrow. Asked God to show me His will." He glanced at her, his eyes kind. "Perhaps He answered through you." The simple words struck Zoe's heart like a bell. She turned to look at the passing landscape, trying to hide the tears that sprang to her eyes. All her life, she'd been a burden to her family, to the town, to everyone who knew her. But here was this gentle man, suggesting that God Himself might have brought her to His door for a purpose. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Zoe sat in her rocking chair by the hearth. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, not tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming gratitude. For the first time since that snowy night when her family cast her out, she felt truly wanted. Brian noticed her tears but didn't hurry to brush them away. Instead, he knelt beside her chair and bowed his head. "Shall we pray together?" Zoe nodded, unable to speak. She slipped from her chair to kneel beside him on the rough wooden floor. The fire crackled softly as Brian's steady voice lifted in prayer, thanking God for His guidance and asking for blessing on the child to come. Outside the cabin windows, winter's grip was loosening. Snow melted from the roof, dripping steadily into the drainage ditches Brian had dug last fall. The sound of running water was like music, nature's own promise that spring would come again, bringing new life and hope with it. Bringing new life and hope with it. In the warm circle of firelight, Zoe felt safer than she had in months. Her hand rested on her belly, where the baby moved gently, as if soothed by Brian's prayers. Together, they remained in that moment of peace, while the last of winter snow trickled away into the softening earth. April brought the scent of damp earth and new grass to the valley. Snowmelt filled the streams until they rushed brown and swollen between their banks. The morning air held a fresh sweetness, though mud made the roads treacherous in Brian's cabin kitchen. Zoe stood at the worn wooden table, her arms dusted with flour as she kneaded bread dough. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming her back. The familiar rhythm of pushing and folding the dough brought comfort to her tired muscles. Without warning, a sharp pain gripped her middle, stealing her breath. The dough slipped from her fingers as she clutched the table's edge. Another pain followed, stronger than the first. She knew what this meant. Brian. Her voice cracked with fear and urgency. He burst through the door from the barn, took one look at her face, and understood. "Hold fast," he said, already reaching for his hat. "I'll fetch Mrs. Wilkins." Zoe watched through the window as Brian hitched the horses with swift efficiency. The wagon wheels splashed through puddles as he urged the team toward town, leaving her alone with her mounting fear and pain. The afternoon light faded to dusk, then dark. Zoe paced the cabin floor, pausing to grip the back of a chair when the pains came. Each hour stretched longer than the last. The lamp's flame cast dancing shadows on the walls as she waited, praying for Mrs. Wilkins to arrive. Finally, she heard the sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Wilkins, her gray hair escaping from beneath her bonnet, medical bag clutched firmly in hand. Brian followed with her traveling case. "Well now, let's see what we have here," Mrs. Wilkins said briskly, removing her shawl. She shooed Brian outside with a firm but gentle hand. "This is women's work now. You pray out there, through the night." Zoe labored. Mrs. Wilkins moved with quiet efficiency, heating water, preparing clean linens, offering encouragement in her steady voice. Outside, Brian kept his vigil. Through the cabin's thin walls, Zoe could hear his boots on the porch boards as he paced. Could picture him standing bareheaded in the cool night air, sending prayers heavenward. The pain built like waves on a rising tide, each one stronger than the last. Zoe gripped the iron bed frame, her knuckles white. Mrs. Wilkins wiped her brow with a cool cloth, murmuring words of support. "That's it, girl. You're doing fine. The baby's coming along just as it should." Dawn was breaking when the final pains came. Mrs. Wilkins's calm voice guided her through each push. Suddenly, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. "A girl," Mrs. Wilkins announced, wrapping the infant in a soft blanket, strong and healthy as can be. Tears streamed down Zoe's cheeks as she cradled her daughter for the first time. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, perfect in every way. "Mercy," Zoe whispered. "Her name is Mercy." Brian's boots creaked on the porch. "Come in now," Mrs. Wilkins called. "Meet this new little one." He entered softly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Praise God," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Praise God for this blessing." Over the next week, neighbors began to appear at the cabin door. Some brought jars of broth, others small bundles wrapped in paper, a hand-sewn gown, tiny knitted booties. Each visitor's eyes held questions they were too polite to ask. But their gifts spoke of acceptance, however hesitant. Not everyone was welcoming. One afternoon, Zoe heard voices near the barn. A man's harsh whisper carried through the spring air. "That child will grow up half orphan, half shame." Mark my words. The cruel words stung, but their power to wound had lessened. Inside the cabin, Brian stood by the fire, Mercy cradled in his strong arms. He rocked gently from foot to foot, humming a low tune. The baby's eyes, already showing hints of blue, fixed on his face as if memorizing every detail. Watching them, Zoe felt something settle in her heart, a peace as fragile as a robin's egg, but real nonetheless. Here in this simple cabin, with this gentle man and her newborn daughter, she had found something she'd never dared to hope for: a family. The evening light painted the cabin walls gold as Brian laid Mercy in the cradle he'd crafted himself. His hand lingered on the smooth wood, and Zoe saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt. Whatever the world might say, in this moment they were complete, the three of them, bound together by something stronger than blood or tradition. Mrs. Wilkins, packing her bag to leave, paused to watch them. A knowing smile touched her lips as she tied her bonnet strings. "God works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Sometimes His greatest gifts come wrapped in trial and trouble." Summer brought long days of golden sunlight to the valley. Morning dews sparkled on the grass as Brian taught Zoe the rhythms of farm life. Under his patient guidance, she learned to tend neat rows of corn, the green stalks reaching toward the sky. Her fingers grew nimble at milking the cows, finding the gentle rhythm that coaxed warm streams into the tin. Bucket, they set up Mercy's cradle beneath a spreading oak tree, where she slept peacefully while they worked. The wooden cradle, lovingly crafted by Brian's hands, rocked with each breeze. Zoe would pause in her chores to check on her daughter, marveling at how the dappled sunlight played across the baby's peaceful face. During quiet moments, Brian taught Zoe the hymns he'd grown up singing. Her voice, hesitant at first, grew stronger as she learned the simple, heartfelt melodies. Soon she found herself humming them while rocking Mercy, the gentle tunes bringing comfort to them both. "You have a fine singing voice," Brian told her one evening as they sat on the porch, Mercy sleeping in her arms. Zoe smiled, ducking her head. "My mama used to sing." Before, she trailed off, but the old pain had softened. Here in this place, new memories were taking root. Laughter came easier now. Brian's quiet humor would catch her by surprise, a gentle jest about a stubborn cow, or a story about his first attempts at baking bread. Their days fell into a comfortable pattern: morning prayers, shared work, simple meals, and peaceful evenings by the hearth. Even the townspeople's whispers seemed to fade as summer deepened. One July afternoon, while Brian was in town repairing a wagon wheel, Zoe worked in the kitchen garden. Mercy lay nearby in her cradle, cooing at butterflies that danced above her. The peaceful scene shattered when hoofbeats approached from the road. Zoe's heart stopped as a familiar figure appeared. The drifter sat tall in his saddle, his hat pulled low against the sun. The same crooked smile played across his face, the smile that had once made her believe his sweet words. Now it sent chills down her spine. "Well, well," he drawled, swinging down from his horse. "Heard tell of a pretty gal with a baby living out here with some plain fellow." He sauntered closer, spurs jingling. "Thought I'd see for myself." Zoe's hands trembled as she scooped Mercy from the cradle, holding her close. The baby whimpered, sensing her mother's fear. "What do you want?" Zoe's voice came out barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, eyes fixed on the bundle in her arms. "That there's my child, ain't it? Figured it was about time I came to claim what's mine." "She's not yours," Zoe said, backing away. "You left. You have no rights." He laughed, the sound harsh in the peaceful garden. "A father's got all the rights in the world. Maybe I'll just take her with me when I go." His hand moved to rest on his gun belt. "Ain't nobody can stop me." Terror gripped Zoe's heart, but she forced herself to stand straight. "Leave us be, please." He spat in the dirt. "I'll be back. Count on it." With a final smirk, he mounted his horse and spurred it hard, kicking up dust as he rode away. Zoe's legs gave way. She sank to the ground, clutching Mercy tight against her chest as tears fell. That's how Brian found them when he returned at sunset, his wagon wheel mended. "Zoe," alarm filled his voice as he hurried to her side. "What's happened?" Through her tears, she told him everything about the drifter's return, his threats, the fear that now gripped her heart. Brian listened quietly, his face grave. When she finished, he took her hand gently. "No man can take what God has entrusted to our care," he said, his voice firm but kind. "That child is yours, given by His grace. We'll protect her together. We'll protect her together." "But he has a gun," Zoe whispered, "and you don't even carry weapons." Brian's eyes held steady. "There are stronger forces than violence. Zoe, faith, law, community. We'll find a way." Though his words brought comfort, fear still coiled in Zoe's heart like a cold snake. That night, she lay awake long after Brian's prayers, listening to Mercy's soft breathing in the cradle beside her bed. The drifter's threats echoed in her mind, mixing with memories of his empty promises and cruel departure. Even Brian's peaceful presence in the next room couldn't fully quiet her fears. She knew the drifter's kind men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. The life she'd built here suddenly felt fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the first hard blow. The drifter wasted no time spreading his poison through the town. In the dim light of saloons, he held court among rough men, his voice carrying loud and deliberate so others would hear his tale. "That plain fellow stole my woman," he proclaimed, slamming his glass on the wooden bar. "Took advantage while I was working honest jobs up north. Now he's got her holed up in that cabin of his, turning her against me." His words found eager ears. Soon, whispers spread like wildfire through the valley. Some claimed Brian had bewitched Zoe with strange German prayers. Others suggested darker things. The drifter played his part well. Acting the wounded father denied his rights. Word reached Zoe's family, who saw a chance to salvage their reputation. They had cast her out in shame, But now they could paint themselves as concerned kinfolk. Her father met with the drifter in secret, plotting how to demand custody of little Mercy. "We'll say she's unfit," her father declared. Living unmarried with that Amish man, no proper Christian would do such a thing. The irony of his words, after abandoning her in the snow, seemed lost on him. Back at the cabin, Zoe noticed Brian's worried looks when he returned from town. "What are they saying?" she asked one evening, dreading the answer. Brian sighed, setting down his cup of tea. "Nothing worth repeating. But remember, words only have the power we give them." Yet sleep became elusive for Zoe. She would lie awake, listening to Mercy's soft breathing from the cradle, imagining rough hands tearing her baby away. During the day, she jumped at every sound from the road, fearing the drifter's return. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Brian found it in his mailbox, an official envelope bearing the county judge's seal. Inside, formal words demanded Zoe's appearance in court the following week to determine custody of the infant. Mercy, Zoe's hands shook as she read the summons. "They're really trying to take her," she whispered. Clutching the paper so tight it crumpled, Brian placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We'll face this together, with truth and dignity." The days before the hearing crawled by like molasses. Zoe threw herself into preparations, wanting everything perfect. She washed and pressed her best dress until it shone. For Mercy, she sewed day and night, crafting a tiny bonnet from scraps of white cotton Brian brought from town. "Your stitches are getting stronger," Brian observed. Watching her work by lamplight, "They have to be," Zoe replied, her needle flashing. "Everything must be just right. They need to see I can care for her proper." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cool. Brian hitched the wagon early, laying clean straw in the bed and setting a quilt for Zoe and Mercy to sit upon. The baby wore her new bonnet, tied with careful bows under her chin. As they rode to Wartown, Zoe felt eyes following them. Women paused in their sweeping to stare. Men stopped their conversations to watch the wagon pass. Whispers trailed in their wake like autumn leaves. "There she goes, the drifter's woman, living in sin with that Amish fellow." Shame about the baby, Zoe held Mercy closer, the child's warm weight anchoring her against the tide of judgment. Brian drove steadily on his back, straight, paying no mind to the watchers. That evening, back in the cabin sanctuary, fear finally overwhelmed Zoe's careful composure. She sat in the rocking chair, Mercy sleeping in her arms, tears rolling down her cheeks. "They'll take her," she whispered, voicing her deepest terror. "The judge will believe their lies. They'll give her to that man who never wanted her, or to my family who cast us out." Brian knelt beside the rocker, his face gentle in the firelight. "The Lord does not abandon his children," he said firmly. "He led me to find you in the snow that night. He gave us Mercy. He will not forsake us now." Taking her hand, Brian helped Zoe to her knees. Together, they knelt on the rough wooden floor. Little Mercy nestled between them like a precious offering. Brian's deep voice led the prayer, asking for strength, wisdom, and justice. Zoe's softer words joined his, carrying their fears and hopes heavenward. The fire crackled softly, its warm light wrapping around the three figures bowed in prayer. Outside, stars wheeled overhead, silent witnesses to their vigil. Tomorrow would bring its trials, but for now, they found peace in their faith and in each other's presence. The county courthouse loomed before them, wooden steps worn by years of troubled feet. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers as Zoe clutched Mercy close, her heart hammering against her ribs. Brian stood beside her, steady as always in his plain black coat and hat. The room filled quickly. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their shops early, all eager to witness the drama. Zoe's family filed in, her father's face hard as granite, her sisters wearing smug expressions that cut deeper than words. The drifter swaggered to his seat, boots clicking on the wooden floor, a theatrical show of confidence. Judge Harrison entered, his gray beard neatly trimmed, crow's feet etched deep around weary eyes. The room rose, then settled into tense silence as he adjusted his spectacles and shuffled through papers. "We're here today," the judge announced, his voice carrying to every corner, "to determine custody of the infant Mercy May." The drifter's lawyer spoke first, his words sharp as arrows. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Zoe May is unfit to raise this child. She's oversized, weak in constitution, and living in improper circumstances with an unmarried man." Zoe flinched at each accusation. Mercy stirred in her arms, sensing her mother's distress. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, gesturing toward Brian, "She resides with a man whose peculiar beliefs make him unfit as a guardian. A man who refuses to bear arms, who won't defend himself or others. How can such a person protect a child?" Murmurs rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Zoe felt the weight of every stare, every judgment. Her cheeks burned with shame. When Brian was called to testify, he moved with quiet dignity to the front. The lawyer circled him like a hawk, demanding explanations for his pacifist beliefs. "Sir, how can you justify refusing to fight, even to protect those in your care?" Brian's voice remained calm, steady as a mountain stream. "The scripture teaches us to overcome evil with good. My people have lived this way for generations, finding strength in faith rather than force. So you would stand idle while others threatened your household? No, sir, not idle. I would stand firm in God's truth and protection. As it is written in Psalms, 'The Lord is my refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble.'" The questioning turned to Zoe's family. Her father painted a picture of a troublesome daughter, while carefully avoiding mention of that snowy night when they had cast her out. Her sisters added their poison. Speaking of her loose ways and simple mind, the drifter took the stand next, playing the role of concerned father with practiced charm. "I only want what's best for my child," he declared, though he had never once asked after Mercy's welfare before this day. Zoe felt herself shrinking beneath the weight of their words, her spirit crumbling like dry leaves. Then Mercy began to cry, a clear, strong sound that cut through the courtroom's heavy air. Looking down at her daughter's face, Zoe felt something spark inside her chest. The words Brian had read to her so many times whispered in her memory. "The Lord is my refuge and strength." She held Mercy closer, drawing courage from her warmth. The baby's cries subsided to soft coos, as if sensing her mother's renewed resolve. Judge Harrison leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles again. "I require more testimony before making my ruling," he declared. "We will reconvene in 3 days' time." This court is adjourned. The crowd shuffled out, their whispers following Zoe and Brian like persistent shadows. The drifter brushed past them, deliberately bumping Brian's shoulder. Brian didn't react, but Zoe saw his jaw tighten slightly. The ride home seemed longer than usual, each bump in the road jarring Zoe's fragile composure. Once inside the cabin, with Mercy settled in her cradle, Zoe's strength finally gave way. She collapsed against Brian's chest, her tears soaking into his plain shirt. "I can't bear it," she sobbed. "Their cruel words, their lies. How can they twist everything so wrong? Twist everything so wrong." Brian's arms encircled her, strong and sure. "Truth stands firm like bedrock," he murmured. "Let their words wash over you like water over stone." But Zoe couldn't stop trembling, overwhelmed by the day's ordeal. What if the judge believes them? What if he takes Mercy away? Brian held her closer, his heartbeat steady against her ear. "We must trust in the Lord's guidance," he said softly. "He has brought us this far. He will not forsake us now." Outside, the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the cabin's rough walls with golden light. Mercy slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the storm gathering around her future. Zoe remained in Brian's embrace, drawing strength from his unwavering faith, trying to still her fears about what the next court session would. The pale light of dawn crept through the cabin windows as Zoe stirred from her restless sleep. Mercy's soft whimpers drew her from beneath the warm quilt. Moving quietly so as not to wake Brian, she lifted her daughter from the cradle, cradling her close, near the hearth's dying embers. Zoe settled into the wooden rocking chair to feed Mercy warm milk from a bottle. The familiar creaking of the chair runners against the floorboards soothed them both. As her daughter drank contentedly, Zoe watched the first rays of sunlight paint golden strips across the cabin walls. Brian's words from their many evening talks echoed in her mind. Forgiveness must be lived, not spoken. She had witnessed how he lived this truth daily, facing townspeople's scrutiny with quiet dignity. While others wielded words like weapons, Brian's actions spoke of grace and strength. The truth settled in her heart like a stone dropping into still water. Her silence in court was a kind of surrender. By letting others speak for her, about her, she was giving away not just her voice, but her power. She looked down at Mercy's innocent face and felt something shift. Inside her chest, a determination taking root. When they entered the courthouse later that morning, Zoe walked differently, her spine straighter despite her trembling hands. Brian noticed the change, casting her questioning glances as they took their seats. The familiar faces filled the benches, her stern-faced father, her sneering sisters. The drifter with his practiced charm. Judge Harrison called the session to order, his gavel's sharp crack echoing through the packed room. As the proceedings began, Zoe's heart thundered in her chest. Before the drifter's lawyer could rise, she stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice quavering but clear. "I wish to speak." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Brian's eyes widened, but a small smile tugged at his lips. The judge studied her over his spectacles, then nodded slowly. Zoe took a deep breath, holding Mercy closer. "I know what people see when they look at me," she began. "They see my size and call me weak. They see my past mistakes and call me shameful." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But they don't see the nights I've spent rocking my daughter singing hymns until she sleeps. They don't see how I rise before dawn to help with chores. How I've learned to milk cows and tend gardens despite my weakness." The usual whispers had died away. Even her sisters sat straight-backed, their smugness faltering. "I made mistakes," Zoe continued, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "I trusted wrongly and paid dearly. But through God's grace, I found strength I never knew I had. I found a home where forgiveness isn't just talked about, but lived daily." She turned slightly toward Brian, whose eyes shone with quiet pride. "I learned that true strength isn't in harsh words or raised fists, but in gentle hands and patient hearts. Every day, I work to be worthy of the mercy I've been shown." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his lined face intent on her words. The usual weariness in his eyes had given way to keen interest. "This man," she gestured to the drifter, "claims he wants what's best for Mercy. But where was he during the long nights of my pregnancy? Where was he when I labored to bring her into this world? Where was he during her first smile, her first laugh?" Her voice grew fierce with maternal protection. "My daughter knows my voice, my touch, my love. She knows Brian's gentle strength and daily care. These are not things that can be claimed by those who were never present." Tears streamed freely down her face now. But Zoe didn't bow her head or wipe them away. "I stand before you changed from the girl I was. I am a mother who will fight for her child with everything I have, not with fists or harsh words, but with truth and love and daily dedication." The silence in the courtroom was complete. Even the usual creaking of the wooden benches had stilled. Brian reached over and squeezed her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. In that touch, she felt all his pride and support. Judge Harrison removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. His eyes never left Zoe's face. The drifter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his practiced charm cracking under the weight of her honest words. Zoe's family sat rigid, their earlier confidence dimmed by her unexpected show of strength. Mercy stirred in her arms, reaching up to pat her mother's wet cheek with a tiny hand. The simple gesture drew a watery smile from Zoe. She remained standing, shoulders straight, tears drying on her cheeks. The truth of her love and dedication hung in the air, more powerful than any legal argument or social judgment. 3 days passed like molasses in winter. Each morning, Zoe checked on Mercy in her cradle, fear knowing at her heart that this might be their last dawn together. Brian kept his usual routines, feeding chickens, milking cows, reading scripture by lamplight, but his eyes often strayed to the window, watching for riders bringing news. On the 4th morning, as Brian hitched the wagon for their return to court, Mrs. Wilkins came hurrying up the path. "Judge Harrison's made his decision," she called out, waving a notice in her hand. "You're summoned straight away." The courthouse buzzed like a disturbed beehive when they arrived. Every bench was packed, with folks standing along the walls. Zoe clutched Mercy closer, drawing strength from her daughter's warm weight. Brian stood beside them, his quiet presence steady as always. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. The room fell silent, save for the creak of wooden floors beneath shuffling feet. He settled into his chair, arranging papers before him with deliberate care. Having heard all testimony and examined the evidence, the judge began, his voice filling every corner of the hushed room. "I find the plaintiff's claim of parental rights to be without merit." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The drifter half rose from his seat, face darkening like a thundercloud. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, raising his voice slightly, "I uphold the current arrangement. Miss Zoe May shall retain full custody of the child Mercy, with Mr. Brian Lapp's guardianship maintained as established." The drifter exploded from his chair. "This ain't justice," he snarled, shoving past his lawyer. "That's my flesh and blood." His boots thundered across the floorboards as he stormed toward the door, cursing under his breath. The bang of the courthouse door echoed like a gunshot. Zoe's family huddled in their bench, faces flushed with shame. Her father studied his hat brim while her sisters whispered behind raised hands. As the crowd began to disperse, they shuffled toward the door, not once meeting her eyes. "The Lord's justice prevails," Brian murmured, helping Zoe gather Mercy's blanket and bottle. His hand was gentle at her elbow as they made their way down the courthouse steps. Truth prevailed. The ride home was quiet, filled with the steady clip-clop of hooves and the soft coos of Mercy sleeping in Zoe's arms. The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and purple, a sight that seemed more beautiful than ever before. That evening, they shared a simple supper of fresh-baked bread, warm beans, and cool milk from that morning's milking. The familiar kitchen, with its worn wooden table and curtains stirring in the evening breeze, felt like the most peaceful place on earth. Every bite tasted of victory and blessing. After supper, Zoe carried a sleeping Mercy to her cradle, tucking the quilt around her tiny form. Relief washed over her in waves as she watched her daughter's peaceful face. No more fear of separation. No more nights wondering if each moment might be their last together. Tears of gratitude slipped down her cheeks. The lamp cast a warm glow across the cabin as Brian stepped up beside her. His hands, usually so sure with horses and tools, fidgeted slightly with his hat brim. When he reached for her hand, his palm was warm against hers. "Zoe," he said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle strength she'd come to rely on. These months with you and Mercy, they've brought light back to this home. Back to my heart, she turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same tender care that had first given her hope on that snowy morning so long ago. I'm asking you, Brian continued, his fingers tightening slightly around hers, to join your life to mine. Not from duty, not from necessity, but because love has grown here. As sure as spring follows winter. He paused, drawing a deep breath. Will you marry me, Zoe May? Will you make this family complete in the eyes of God and man? Tears flowed freely down Zoe's cheeks as she squeezed his hand. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, the word carried all her gratitude, all her joy, all her love for this gentle man who had shown her what true strength looked like in her cradle. Mercy stirred and cooed softly in her sleep. The lamp flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the gathering dusk, its song sweet and clear in the perfect stillness of the moment. Spring breezes carried the scent of lilacs as preparations for the wedding filled Brian's homestead with quiet industry. What had begun as whispers of doubt among the Amish community transformed into gestures of acceptance. One kindness at a time, Sarah Yoder, who had once turned away at meeting, arrived first, carrying a carefully folded quilt in shades of blue and purple. For your new home, she said softly to Zoe, her eyes warm with understanding. Others followed Martha Stoltzfus with bags of fresh ground flour, Rachel Miller bearing wheels of aged cheese wrapped in muslin. Each gift spoke of welcome, of community embracing what God had brought together. In the evenings, after Mercy was settled in her bed, Brian worked in the barn by lantern light. The sound of his tools, the rhythmic scrape of plane against wood, the tap of hammer on chisel drifted through the spring air. He was crafting a cradle, each curve and joint shaped with careful precision. When Zoe asked to see it, he shook his head with a gentle smile. For after the wedding, he said, his eyes twinkling, Zoe spent her days at the treadle sewing machine, working on her wedding dress. The fabric was plain, as befitted an Amish bride, a deep blue cotton that reminded her of twilight skies. As she guided the material under the needle, each stitch felt like a prayer of gratitude. The steady rhythm of the treadle matched the peace in her heart. On the morning of the wedding, thin clouds veiled the sun, casting a pearl-like glow across the valley. Brian hitched his best horse to the freshly painted wagon, its wooden sides gleaming with care. Zoe settled into the seat, cradling Mercy in her lap. The baby cooed and reached for Brian's beard as he climbed up beside them, making both parents laugh. The meeting house stood plain and strong against the spring sky. Inside, voices raised in hymns, the German words flowing like a gentle stream. Zoe recognized the melody now. After months of worship with these people who had become family, standing before the congregation, Zoe's hand trembled slightly in Brian's steady grip. His voice was clear and sure as he spoke his vows, promising to cherish and protect both her and Mercy. When Zoe's turn came, her words rang with quiet conviction, pledging her love and faith before God and community. Bishop Stoltzfus pronounced them man and wife as sunlight broke through the clouds, streaming through the windows like a blessing. For the first time in her life, Zoe felt completely cherished, completely at home. The congregation gathered afterward, sharing fresh bread and steaming bowls of broth. Quiet joy filled the meeting house as children played softly in corners and women exchanged knowing smiles. Mercy, passed from arm to arm, seemed to bask in the love surrounding her new family. In that moment of celebration, Zoe caught Brian's eye across the room. His smile held all the warmth of home, all the promise of their shared tomorrow. Sunlight danced across the dusty road as Zoe, Brian, and little Mercy made their way toward the plain one-room church. The morning air held the sweet promise of late spring, carrying the sound of children's laughter ahead of them. The white steeple rose against the blue sky. its bell calling the faithful to worship. Brian cradled Mercy in one arm while holding Zoe's hand with the other. His steady stride matched hers, unhurried and peaceful. The wooden steps creaked beneath their feet as they climbed to the church door, where morning glory vines twisted around weathered posts inside. Sunbeams spilled through clear glass windows, painting golden paths across worn wooden benches. The congregation settled into their seats as the first notes of a hymn rose toward the rafters. Zoe's voice lifted with the others, clear and unafraid. Gone was the trembling woman who had once hidden in shadows. Now she stood tall, her size no longer a source of shame, but a testament to God's abundance. Brian's deep voice harmonized beside her as he gently rocked Mercy, who cooed softly in his arms. The same townsfolk who had once crossed the street to avoid her now smiled and nodded warmly. Mrs. Wilson, the shopkeeper's wife, reached over to touch Mercy's tiny hand, her eyes twinkling with genuine affection. After the final, Amen neighbors gathered their things and headed toward the Lapp farm. Wagons and buggies kicked up dust along the familiar road, carrying families eager to share fellowship. The afternoon filled with the aroma of hearty stew and the sound of genuine laughter. Children played in the yard while women exchanged recipes and men discussed the coming harvest, as twilight painted the sky in soft purples. Zoe settled into her rocking chair on the porch. The lantern cast a warm glow as she held Mercy close, breathing in her sweet baby scent. "We are not forsaken," she whispered, her heart full of gratitude. Brian's strong hand came to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of love and protection that had become as natural as breathing. Together they gazed out at the wide valley, where fireflies had begun their evening dance above the wheat fields. The future stretched before them like those endless fields, rich with possibility, rooted in faith, and nurtured by love. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.